Good day, everybody. I want us to get started because we have an amazing panel coming up and people will probably still be rolling in and there's lunch happening out there, but we don't want to lose the time that we have with our exceptional speakers today and focused on this very important event. I would say an urgent event thinking about urban governance and climate mobility. Which is obviously being sponsored by the Bloomberg Center. But also I want to underscore that it's being sponsored by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR. Now, let me introduce myself, and that's going to come back to the CIFAR issue. I'm Diane Davis. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the Graduate School of Design. I'm also a proud affiliate of the Bloomberg Center. I've come to so many great events here, a faculty affiliate. And as well, I'm the co-director of a project that's funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research called Humanity's Urban Future that brings together 12 scholars, which we call fellows, from around the world to tackle that rather fundamental and urgent question of what is the future of cities, humanity's urban future, although we could think about humanity as well as cities in that framing. So beyond feeling a bit embarrassed about the hubris that's embedded in the title of a project that gives people money to kind of speculate or think about humanity's urban future, I think what I loved about this initiative, and it's going to filter through some of the conversation today, is to call on us to think not just about the past and the present, but about the future and where we're going. Maybe we'll hear a little bit more from urban governing officials and planners who are often stuck in the present. I don't want to say stuck. Sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for bad reasons. They're limited political terms, try to get things done in a short amount of time. But you're dealing with problems that don't know temporal boundaries. They also, I might add, don't know jurisdictional boundaries, but that's another issue that I'm working on. And, so many climate problems move beyond the localities that exist. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to try to do something about it at the scale where there is some politics, power, and institutions. So that's kind of a framing of kind of not only what we'll talk about today, but this Humanity's Urban Future group. And I won't introduce them, but there are several people from different programs at CIFAR that are here to talk together about the notion of humanity's urban future, maybe building on the remarks that we're going to hear today about how governing officials think about preparing for climate crisis or dealing with the current climate crisis, but also thinking about impending, intensification of these problems. The CIFAR fellows are thinking about that from a variety of different disciplines: science and technology studies, political science, anthropology. We have geoscientists, including folks that have been involved in looking at whether there's capacity for life on Mars, et cetera, where we're bringing interdisciplinary people together to think about humanity's urban future. And we wanted to start our weekend, which is a private workshop, with a public conversation that is generated by people who are actually doing something now or trying to do something now, and how we will think about that as we also speculate about where things head in the future. I just would say that, and I know Hannah's going to give another introduction, I just would underscore, which is probably obvious to everybody here, and that's why you're in the room, that in order to think about urban futures in the context of climate change, we need to better understand how urban actors, both citizens and authorities, are confronting human settlement into and out of cities, or even within cities themselves, how they move to high ground, low ground, et cetera, and how they are using their platforms and resources, whether it's social capital or real capital, to engage both their constituencies and specific ecologies as populations and traditional forms of habitability are being challenged or transformed. And I can think of no better panel to address these questions. We have officials from two very environmentally challenged locations, Florida and Texas, who've had to come. Now we're going to hear more about that from climate disasters. We have, I understand, 500 people online internationally. And we also have David Lubell. So we have Commissioner Shea, Mayor James, David Lubell, who's worked both locally and internationally with maybe sharing knowledge about how the planet is, how urbanists across the planet are dealing with climate change. So that's the intent of the day. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Bloomberg Center for all the amazing help. And let me turn it over to Hannah.
Yeah. Thank you, Diane. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Teicher. I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at the Graduate School of Design, and I'm really excited to see the enthusiastic response to this event. It's an issue that I think about pretty much every day, so I'm really glad to see lots of interest. To begin this conversation, I'd like to tackle some myths about climate migration head-on. I'm drawing from Carol Farbatko, who has critiqued the specter of mass climate migration across international borders. You may have seen alarmist media reports predicting climate migrants numbering from 25 million to 1 billion by 2050. These numbers are often tossed around by reputable organizations, but they are uncertain and hard to predict. And it's difficult to directly link long-distance international migration to climate change, largely because migration has complex drivers. Economic, political, and climate conditions are intertwined, and climate may not be the most salient factor to migrants themselves or immigration bureaucracies. So far, internal displacement due to climate impacts is much more common than international migration. We have seen this all too frequently here in the U.S., with the disastrous effects of wildfires in LA and floods in North Carolina and Texas, to name a few. Last year, the U.S. set a record with 11 million residents internally displaced due to natural disasters. Globally, 46 million people were displaced for this same reason, and another 20 million were displaced due to conflict or violence. The notion of mass climate migration across international borders is not only misleading, it can have harmful effects. It renders migration a national security issue and fuels anti-immigrant politics. It can lead to misguided policy, such as developing visas for climate migration, instead of supporting adaptation in place in vulnerable countries. As we embark on this conversation, I'd suggest we keep some additional nuances in mind. Migration doesn't occur as a single event, but a long, fraught process. People relocating face hardships in the places they leave behind, the places they pass through, and their ultimate destinations. The arrival of newcomers can also create challenges for existing residents in those destinations. Cities with climate-related migration are likely to experience it in multiple ways, with some people moving internally, others leaving, and others moving in. These each create their own set of difficulties. As places experience climate impacts, households and communities relocate, but so do a whole range of private entities, from small businesses to large corporations. Corporate climate migration, which I'm currently researching, is likely to shape the geography of opportunity for individuals and households seeking climate resilience. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists to help us better understand the realities and complexities of working on climate migration and to point us towards some constructive ways forward. And before I introduce them, just a disclaimer, their views are their own, not those of Harvard University. Today, we are honored to have with us Brigid Shea, Commissioner of Travis County, Texas, and the Board Chair of ICLEI USA, Keith James, the Mayor of West Palm Beach, Florida, and David Lubell, the Senior Climate Mobility and Cities Fellow for ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. So I'd like to start with the basics. Could you tell us briefly how you came to this work? Maybe starting with Mayor James.
Thank you for having me this afternoon, and this is a very timely topic. West Palm Beach has been experiencing transformative growth within recent years, within the past 5 years. I wouldn't necessarily call it because of climate migration, because if you think about it, we are a coastal city, and we are, we celebrate or we were forewarned by hurricane season, which is 6 months out of the year, from November, from June 1st to November 1st is our hurricane season, and we watch the climate with bated breath, hoping that a hurricane doesn't hit us. So I say that because we are climate vulnerable, right? I mean, so the fact that we are a coastal city in South Florida, we could get hit by the H word. I don't even like to say hurricane this time of year. Hit by the H word anytime. However, that has not stopped the growth. So when I think of migration into my city, it's not necessarily climate migration is top of mind, but I have to be sensitive to the potential impact of climate change on my city. So I have to work each and every day to make us more sustainable, to make us more resilient to the forces of climate change, because that's my job to protect my citizens. And we can get in more about some specifics that we're doing later.
Commissioner Shea, would you weigh in?
Yeah, I came to this issue actually in 1988. I'd been a reporter with NPR stations in Minnesota and Philadelphia, and I was working as a national press secretary in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1988 when James Hansen, anybody know who he is? Show of hands. This crowd should. He was the head of the Goddard Space Institute at NASA at the time, and he was really the first scientist that called attention to global warming. And his testimony was a front page story on the New York Times, and it changed my life. I was in DC and I read the story and called friends and said, we all have to drop what we're doing and work on this issue, or we can measure our coffins and get in. So who's doing this work? And there was an organization that was getting started in Texas, Clean Water Action, and they were looking for people to help organize around water and climate and political issues. And I just said, sign me up. I'd never been to Texas. All my friends in Washington said, those people are crazy. They all have guns. Anyway, so I came to Texas in 1988 to work on this issue, and I've been at it in one form or another ever since.
Amazing. And that's a good reminder that this is not new.
It's not new.
Yeah. David?
Sure. So I have most of my career been involved in immigrant welcoming. So I was welcomed by a family in Ecuador way back in 1999 where I was teaching English. And because I was welcomed, I thrived. I learned Spanish. I had a great experience. And when I came back, I wanted to make sure other people arriving in communities in the United States also could experience that welcome. And so eventually started an organization called Welcoming America. We started working on helping one community become more welcoming and inclusive to immigrants. And over time it grew to well over 200 cities across the US. And so I learned a lot about, in-migration and how communities can respond positively and proactively to in-migration, but it was primarily around immigrants. It was actually later when I moved with my family to Berlin to sort of spread this welcoming communities approach to other places in the world. Living in Berlin was just very eye-opening for me around, like all my friends were very focused on climate and all levels, government, it was just a much more of a intentional recognition of the fact that this is truly the existential issue of our time. But they were actually, trying to do things about it much more than I found here. And so when I came back with my family to the US, I really wanted to work on climate, but it just made sense if I'm going to work on climate, focus on the area where I can make the most difference based on my experience. So that's when I sought out a funder that I'd worked with who was starting to work on climate migration or climate mobility or whatever you want to call it. And then I connected with ICLEI, who was also interested in getting more involved. And ICLEI is a large sustainability cities network, global network. I'm with ICLEI USA, which has about 450 municipal members in the United States. And so that's the path over, and I'm happy I did it.
Okay, great. Commissioner Shea, could you tell us a little bit about how exactly you're working on this issue today?
The larger focus has been preparedness for the impacts of climate. And in Texas, climate change has been a dirty phrase for a long time, so I've had to talk about it in terms where people can hear it, which is what can we do at the local government level to try and minimize the harm to you and your family and neighbors from increasingly destructive and deadly weather. And everybody gets that. And so we've had a lot of conversations about that because we've had a lot of really extreme and destructive and deadly weather events all across Texas. So I started there, and we've now created 4 initiatives that have won national awards for climate resilience. But it's been in that context of helping people be better prepared for the impacts. So that's the larger context of it. The whole conversation around the impact of people having to relocate, for instance, away from the Texas coast because sea level rise and storm surge will make so many of their homes uninhabitable, uninsurable. That's a newer conversation, and that's made more difficult because there's been a tremendous amount of growth in Travis County is Austin, Texas, basically. And there's been an enormous amount of in-migration from people just moving there because it's an appealing place to live in a lot of ways, which has caused a huge spike in housing costs and a lot of resentment by the community. And in that regard, it's clear to me that the impacts of climate change are incredibly politically destabilizing. There have been changes in elective office because people were so unsatisfied with how expensive rents had become that young people couldn't afford to buy homes. They're blaming local elected officials for these phenomena. And it has a huge impact on the body politic. So we're just starting to look at these larger issues of the impact of climate displacement. And it's a difficult issue to talk about, and it's difficult to find local solutions. I think we have to, but it's going to be an increasingly difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really interesting way to frame it. That really goes to my next question, which is that there seem to be so many intersecting crises right now. You know, we have the housing crisis, the climate crisis, you know, perhaps a crisis of democracy. And some would say that all of these things intersect, but sometimes it's hard to make climate a priority. And so I'm curious, you know, how you're able to do that. How are you able to give it the attention that you think it needs? And Mayor James, what are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, again, I am mayor of a city, so my loyalties are to serve the interests of the residents of my city. Commissioner, you're also right that it's in messaging, right? Yeah. You live in Texas, I live in Florida. Our state governments basically try to pull the wool over our eyes and say there's no such thing as global warming, climate change, sea level rise, etc. So in order to have impact with the messaging, you got to talk about sustainability, you've got to talk about resilience, and you have to talk about preparedness in the case you have a major weather event. Basically, different paths leading to the same result, but it's what you call it. But when I'm serving the citizens, I have to be sensitive to the affordability of housing. I have to be sensitive to property insurance rise. Now there's a move afoot to even eliminate property taxes in my state. So those are the kind of little mini battles that I have to fight as mayor. But all of it kind of, it's like a Venn diagram. There is a magic area in there where they all come together, which is how do you make your city more livable at the end of the day? Whether you call it climate, response to climate change, whether you call it housing affordability, it's how do we make, and my job as mayor is how do I make West Palm Beach more livable? My vision has always been to make it a community of opportunity for all, but when you have these different crises, it carries a number of different hats, and so that's the challenge.
That's a good point, that could all come together under livability. So David, could you speak to how you see those crises playing out and perhaps conflicting in your work?
Sure. So I would say clearly when it comes to the poly crisis that climate migration it will both, and already is starting to exacerbate inequality, exacerbate political polarization. And if we don't plan for it, it's gonna keep doing that. So it's a cycle this is one part. It gets fed by the cycle, it feeds the cycle. But yeah, if we think about, I was just in New Orleans about 2 weeks ago for the 20th anniversary of Katrina. And if you look at just that as one example, this was one of the biggest internal displacement events in the history of the United States, maybe the most. 1.5 million people were dispersed across the United States, to all 50 states actually, from that event. And so on the inequality side, if you look at the data, the people who had, there's different ways to prepare or not prepare. If you're the city of New Orleans and you want to prepare, you got to prepare for people who are displaced to come back and not fall through the cracks when they come back. And that preparation wasn't there on the city level, but also state level, also federal level. And so a ton of people fell through the cracks, and a lot of people couldn't even afford to live anymore with the housing spikes in New Orleans. So, tens of thousands of people or more have never come back to New Orleans. But the outcomes for the people who did come back, for the people who are most vulnerable, they got more vulnerable, more poor, more lower outcomes. And then the people who left, who went to other cities and states around the country, their outcomes were also worse than people who were from those receiving communities. Again, because those communities weren't prepared for effectively welcoming the migrants that came in for the most part. And then you talked about this question about how do you start to get places to prepare, because that is really one of the key ingredients is preparation, but you need to want to prepare. And I'd say that there are, the early adopter cities. We have 25 cities now, cities and counties. Travis County is part of it, for example, that are starting a cohort within ICLEI that I'm helping lead on climate mobility. How can they get ready for climate mobility? And the incentives are different for the early adopters depending on their geography. And so if you're from a vulnerable community, a community that's likely to get hit by directly hit by a disaster, some administrators are starting to realize, wow, if that happens, we're not ready. We're not ready to address the equity issues, much less the liability issues. We need to start planning better for people being displaced and coming back. And so we have some of those early adopter towns and cities in that network. Then there's the middle of the road, sandwich generation towns, cities, counties, like Travis County in Texas, where you're both still vulnerable, but not as vulnerable as communities that you're closer to. Travis County is vulnerable, but not as much as, say, Houston. And so you need to be ready for large numbers of people coming from places like Houston or even further towards the coast, but you also have to be ready for a disaster hitting your own community. So that's a potential double whammy. And so there's just early adopting communities with early adopter leaders in those places that are starting to come ahead and say, yeah, this is not just morally correct. This is fiscally, we need to do this. From an equity perspective, we're going to be in big trouble if we don't plan for this. And then you've got communities more in the Great Lakes region, which is where people predict a lot of people will eventually. And I'm using this for the U.S., but those who are listening from other countries, it's a similar dynamic. You have coastal cities or cities that face other threats, and you have these different types of dynamics. And so the third dynamic in the U.S. is primarily cities in the Great Lakes region with all of that fresh water, relatively more protected. No place is fully protected, but relatively more protected from the worst climate disasters. And so for them, the people who are early adopting are often thinking about, wow, we've been losing population for a while. Maybe we could actually start to increase population by welcoming people coming here. Or maybe this is an economic development opportunity. And then others just saying, people are going to come, we need to get ready. But those types of finding out ways to find early adopters who see the need, not just from, again, a moral standpoint, but from a very practical standpoint, is how we start the train running. And the train needs to run. We need to build this readiness now, not when the numbers start getting a lot bigger.
Okay, well, thanks for giving us that lay of the land. In a lot of conversations that I've been having on this topic, I keep encountering the question of how is it any different to welcome climate migrants versus any other kind of newcomer, whether it's international immigrants or people who are just moving for jobs. So Mayor James, I know that you mentioned your city has been experiencing rapid growth. Do you see planning for climate migrants as being any different from planning for any other newcomer?
In many ways, the planning is the same. Every new resident, every relocated resident, whether they're moving for work or climate change, they're going to need housing. They're going to need public services. And so we need to do whatever we can as city leaders to prepare for that. Again, how do we make our city more livable? The affordability of housing, transportation, and mobility. What kind of jobs are there? So, yes, we need to plan for major weather events, and we are doing that. We've hired consultants to do a vulnerability assessment. If the H word hits our area, how vulnerable are we? Sustainability, how can we make our community more sustainable proactively? And even our waterfront, we are a waterfront city. How can we make changes to our waterfront to make it more adaptable? So we, at the same time we are preparing for the influx, we also have to be wise about making our community more resilient, more sustainable. We have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. So whether people are moving in because of climate concerns, job concerns, et cetera, their needs as new residents of our city remain the same: housing, working, transportation, mobility, affordability.
Mm-hmm. So Commissioner Shea, I think you had also mentioned doing resilience planning. Are there ways that you see that resilience planning being specifically shaped by the prospect of climate migration?
It's interesting, the needs around disasters are so much more immediate than any kind of longer term planning. Like, we dramatically improved our emergency notification system. But that's an immediate thing, to send out alerts timely to people. The old system was based on landlines. Anybody here still have a landline? I mean, literally, it was 500,000 phone numbers that were almost all landlines. So we transitioned that to mobile phones. So now we can actually reach people when there's a disaster coming. But I think that's the problem with so much of this. It's a slower moving disaster. So much of it is tied to market forces. I mean, we've known that we have an affordable housing crisis in the Austin area for a while, and so the counties in Texas have very limited authority. So you got to get really creative. But we partnered with multifamily developers to essentially buy down the rents by our partnership, and it's been pretty successful. We've gotten 13,500 units of pretty much deeply affordable housing, but the multifamily market was overbuilt. And so all the multifamily developers literally stopped building because 50,000 units came on within about an 18-month period. And then now everybody's having to offer discounted rents because there's a glut of housing. And so there's market forces beyond our control that affect whether or not people are going to invest in more housing. So that just makes it harder to do the planning because these market forces are outside our control. But the other big thing that we're going to have to plan for, and because this is such an existential threat, I think a lot of our leaders are literally terrified to even talk about it, and that is our region. And I tell people, if you believe the climate science, and I do, our region is slated to run out of water. Much of the southern United States, and these climate scenarios are pretty much in agreement on this, much of the southern United States will become uninhabitably hot and run out of water. And we're wasting water like drunken sailors at the local level. Everything is built on an assumption that there's an unlimited supply of water. And it's a terrifying conversation for local business leaders to talk about because it's such an existential threat. So I think that combination of it being terrifying, and that we also don't have, frankly, great tools for doing long-range water planning, especially in Texas, has just made it very, very difficult to talk about it in an adult fashion and plan for it over time, and also because all the solutions are very expensive. People think desalination is going to solve the problem, and they don't think about how profoundly expensive it is and the environmental impacts that causes, and particularly in a marine environment like the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico.
Gulf of America.
No, we still call it Gulf of Mexico.
And so if you can't even have the conversation.
Right, because it's too terrifying.
But interestingly, as a counterpoint, David, you have convened, 26 cities to work on this issue? And so how are you able to galvanize their interest in working on this issue? And how do you position it as something that distinctly needs attention, when they could be planning for other kinds of newcomers, or they could be planning for housing affordability?
So it was interesting with the cohort. I interviewed at the beginning of my time with ICLEI. I interviewed about 15 cities and counties pretty intensively just to understand what their take was on all of this and what their needs were. And it's still very early days on all of this. But when we put out the notice for this cohort of cities, which is an investment in time and therefore resources, we got to 25 very quickly, and it was a lot of cities that I hadn't reached out to because we just put it out on the general ICLEI, like, this is one of the cohorts you could join if you want. And so we could have had a lot more than 25 cities. And so, I mean, look at the news. That statistic you mentioned at the beginning, 11 million people displaced in the United States last year alone. 1.5 million or 2 million, the whole Dust Bowl was that number, and now we're talking about 11 million. But that's the biggest, that's a really big number that was put out by the International Center for Climate Displacement. And cities are seeing these things on the news just like we are, but they're also seeing, they look at the risks, even more than most of us do. And so there is that. That's a reason. And then as far as, and I mentioned before these different incentives around maybe economic development, maybe not getting caught with your pants down because you weren't ready when the storm hit and people came back, and all these things. Like people, there are plenty of incentives to drive early adopter cities at this point. But as far as like convincing them to do this, first of all, you don't have to do it, do planning for this and it's in a vacuum. If you're renewing your climate adaptation plan, make this part of your climate adaptation plan. If you're, in order to get FEMA funding, for now anyway, you need to do an emergency disaster plan. Make it part of your emergency, preparedness plan. And so that's another selling point is, that you don't have to invest lots of money or, rock the boat in order to make this part of your planning, part of your policies. And then, you asked about a little bit about the difference between, because there are also a lot of cities that have done planning. A lot have done planning for weather. They're prepared for weather, climate resilience planning, but very fewer have done planning for people. And when I say people, it's people affected by climate. So cities have done planning for people, but primarily that's planning for immigrants. Welcoming America was part of that movement to spur that to happen, but lots of cities were the reason that happened, and still more need to do it. But it's not the same thing. It's similar, and in the cohort that we're doing, we will explain the welcoming standard that Welcoming America created with the field over a year and a half, and Welcoming America certifies cities. Because there's a lot of barriers that are similar, as far as language for some will still be a barrier, having a need to access jobs, all the things that Mayor James talked about, and that his city is on the forefront of making sure when people arrive that they're provided for. But then, it's a different clientele or a different grouping than what we're used to. Immigrants have specific needs, but we're talking about internally displaced people. We haven't had that many internally displaced people, in a very long time, except for Katrina. And so the needs are different, and we need more research. And I've been working, my work is with cities, but also with academics. That's how I met you, Hannah, with activists, with foundations. But together, it's like, all right, what are the gaps in this ecosystem? And one big gap is data. And so cities need data around, okay, I live in Atlanta, I do, and so Atlanta, how many people are going to come is one piece of data from climate, people from the coast in Florida. Atlanta doesn't have that data yet. We need cities, all of the cities that we're talking about need that kind of a data, and we're working on trying to work with experts to obtain or to find out ways to produce that data. And it's possible, it's just going to take time. But then they also need data around, Atlanta doesn't know if there are climate migrants in Atlanta, which there are. What are their needs? Internally displaced people around the world often need a lot of mental health care because they're suffering from trauma, whether they're refugees suffering from war or people displaced from disaster face a lot of trauma as well. And so that's one example of like a hypothesis around one of the needs that the many people in Atlanta, for example, that right now the government and others aren't really aware of being climate migrants. We need to understand how many climate migrants are in Atlanta, what are their needs, how does that differ from other newcomers, and also sometimes people arrive really quickly if there's a bad disaster, and so that's another thing cities aren't really prepared for. It's easier when it's 1, 2 at a time, families, whatever. But if there's a bad disaster in Houston and people start arriving in big numbers in Dallas and in Austin, they need to know how to get ready for that. But the predictive numbers need to be part of the equation.
So you're saying it is a distinct issue and there is a huge need for data and planning. At the same time, there's a big opportunity to build on planning that's already been done, which makes it more tractable. Totally,
yeah. The foundation's there, but we need to build on that foundation.
So I'd like to step back for a minute. In an ideal world, what would planning for climate migration, whether at the city, state, or regional level, look like? What kinds of resources or policies would you envision? Maybe Commissioner Shea?
Yeah, we really have to imagine it, because Texas is not an ideal world. There's really not a good mechanism even for integrated water planning across the state. So for Travis County, we would need to have the data, and that 11 million people figure just from last year is truly sobering. But we've experienced some of it. When Katrina hit, a lot of people came to the Austin area. When Hurricane Harvey hit the Houston area, a lot of people came to the Austin area. So we have some sense of it, but there's not a good mechanism for like tracking that data and then extrapolating from it and trying to sort of figure out some kind of long-term plan. So I think in an ideal world, you'd actually want to have very clear structures and systems for this kind of planning. And I don't see that we have that. So ideally, I think we need to be having these conversations. Again, I call them adult conversations, because I think in so many settings, people are just terrified to talk about it because it's such a profound threat. I mean, in the Austin area, we had a hydrogeologist in a documentary say very clearly that with climate change, our main drinking water reservoir would dry up for a year or more at a time. And there were all kinds of community leaders in the room. I could literally hear them, stifle a gasp, but no one has talked about it since. And I think it's because it's such an existential threat to the economy. So I think we have to begin having these conversations. I think the data is really helpful because that provides some kind of factual foundation for saying, this is happening. This is what happened last year. We know there will be more and more extreme storms in the future that will displace people. So we have to begin looking at where those people go and what it will take for the receiving communities to be prepared. So I think we just need better systems. I think we need to have clearer, factual conversations about what's already happening and what will likely continue to happen and get more severe. And then we just got to, have sort of inventories for communities. We already know that we're going to have serious water shortages. We know that we have housing glut for the moment, but that will be absorbed, and then the housing will be very expensive again. So you can identify the basic needs in a community, that you'd need to be working on in order to be better prepared. But I think that it really has to start with a clear, factual conversation about what the impact will be to the communities that will be receiving cities.
So speaking of factual and adult conversations, Mayor James, if we were able to take away the climate denial at the state level, what would you see as an ideal approach to planning for climate migration?
Well, you're absolutely right. Both of the speakers that spoke before me were right. You got to get the data, all right? And so that's where institutions like this, academicians, can do the research in order to get the data so that we're making data-based decisions. But in addition to, in a perfect world, as you say, the issue, the results, the recommendations from the data need to be fully funded at the federal, state, and local levels. I'm the mayor of a city. However, climate change, sea level rise, doesn't just affect West Palm Beach in a vacuum. It's a regional area. I mean, I'm in Palm Beach County, it's just in South Florida, but there's also Broward County, where Fort Lauderdale is located. There's also Dade County, which is further south, where Miami is located. These issues are regional in impact. And so the funding should not just have to come out of the city coffers. It needs to be done at the local, state, and federal levels. Now there's conversation that FEMA is going to cut back. So when we do have a disaster, more of that financial burden is going to fall on the affected cities. Listen, we are a country of 50 states. And so we can't pretend that what happens because of a Sandy in New York doesn't have an impact on the rest of the country. And so what may happen in New York one year may happen in Florida another year. And so we all need to, we need the federal government to step up and help each of those states as it happens, because none of those states and none of those cities can accurately budget for a disaster. You just can't do it. So in a perfect world, the funding to address these issues would come from all levels of government. And then we need to continue to leverage our partnerships with the universities. We should not shut them out when it comes to urban planning. We need to welcome them because they can a lot of times get that data that we need to make decisions upon. And so it should be a collaborative effort in a perfect world. And so unfortunately, just by saying what I said, we are unfortunately miles away from that perfect world.
Yes. And the U.S. context is particularly challenging right now. So David, I'm curious, from your international experience, are there cities or countries that you see as models?
Yeah, I would say, one thing to note is that the Global South has been dealing with these issues for a lot longer than the Global North, despite the fact that the Global North has created most of the carbon pollution that has created the challenges in the Global South. And so, of course, we should be looking for innovations, and the most innovations so far have happened on this topic in the Global South. So two examples there's more, of course, but two examples. One is the Climate Resilient Migrant Friendly Towns initiative in Bangladesh, which is very much an underwater kind of country, and so the most vulnerable country I believe in the world to flooding. And so this initiative, which has been going on for a number of years, I really like it. First of all, just the name of it is pretty cool, because there's nothing else like it. But also just the way they've thought about it. And this is something that it's a collaboration between international NGOs, federal government, or the national government, local communities, local NGOs. But the idea is, how do we, right now, people are being displaced due to climate all over Bangladesh. They end up in Dhaka, they end up in the major city that doesn't have the capacity to absorb them. properly. And so they've been working with towns in other parts of Bangladesh that are willing and interested in taking on this, becoming, having more hard infrastructure to withstand climate effects, but also, more policies that address the barriers that climate migrants from other parts of the country. And yeah, most climate migration is within country, and certainly that's the case in Bangladesh. And so yeah, making sure that those towns are ready, but also thinking about how to bring industry to those towns, because there is a need for employment. That's one of the basic needs that people, have. And so they've been also working to find out ways to work with the government and others to bring in industries into these different towns and cities. And I think that's a really interesting example. When I went to New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, there was a group that we met with, and a community voice in New Orleans, and they've been doing amazing work engaging low-income community members in New Orleans who, first of all, can't afford to live in New Orleans. Housing prices after Katrina went through the roof, and they just can't afford to live there anymore. Plus, if there's another disaster, they can't afford to, because there's not enough. They don't really get very much money when they have to leave, and so they're looking to move. A lot of the people in this membership organization, and so they're creating a framework to decide where they might want to move. And one of the places they're looking at is Natchez, Mississippi. But Natchez doesn't have a ton of industry. There's a lot of other reasons. They have social ties, other reasons why they want to move there. But they're also thinking about, well, how do we make sure there's enough jobs that when people start moving there? And this is something that has been, they've been addressing this in Bangladesh for years now. So I'd love to see an exchange between those two places as that builds out. Another thing we haven't talked about too much is planned relocation or managed retreat, which is when, and this happens in communities across the country where there's parts of a community that just are not, are in the floodplain or not viable really anymore. And how do you help a community move? And that's, what this group in New Orleans is in effect doing. But there's a program in Fiji that's seen as a real model for this planned relocation work, where the national government is very involved, using an equity lens, working with local practitioners who guide these processes. So they're very locally owned managed retreat efforts that are supported, not imposed upon by the national government. And they've done, successful relocations, about 4 or 5 villages, which is impressive, and something that we all can learn from. So yeah, these should be part of the equation. I'll just say one other model. The week before I went to New Orleans, I went to Cincinnati, where they were doing climate mobility planning. They were doing a big climate mobility planning process event. They had spent 3 months with an organization called Green Umbrella, a consulting firm with Anna Morandi, who's an expert in this topic, and then the city of Cincinnati spent several months doing focus groups in the community, meetings to engage. What would it be like for Cincinnati to be, a welcoming place for climate migrants? And then they did when I went there, and the mayor spoke, and it was a great event, huge turnout. But really thinking about how do we plan before people again start coming in larger numbers. How do we plan for this in Cincinnati? And so that's a model that we'll be talking about in our cohort for sure, along with these international models. But there are other models for sure around the U.S. as well as around the world. And we can make some of these things into reality, but it's nice to know what's possible also, or what's, even dream about what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, it's really good to point to these examples that suggest this is real, this is happening now, and there's something we can do. This is not just a pipe dream. And I want to push on that a little bit further, looking at the reality that we're facing here now, where we're in a broadly anti-climate, anti-immigrant, potentially even anti-government period. How do you work on this issue? And maybe Mayor James, to you first. You're working in a state where climate change denial is baked into state law. So how do you work on climate now?
Well, again, I think it's how you label it, right? Mm-hmm. What you call it, sustainability, resilience. You don't use those triggering words, but you try to get to the same results just calling it something different. And so we have to be strategic in that approach. Also, we build our relationships with the private sector and the philanthropic sector. I don't think we've really talked enough about the role of philanthropic groups. And I think they could be very vital to this because they could bring money to the issue, but they can also bring research to the issue as well. And so I think as city leaders, it's important for us to look beyond just our political bubble, if you will, and expand our relationships with the private sector and the philanthropic sector. Here is another impediment, and that is simply the term limits of elected officials. Under our charter, as mayor, I can do 8 years. I'm into my second term, so I can, if I want, just easily kick the can down the road for another year and a half, and I'm gone. Deuces. I'll leave that problem to somebody else. But that wouldn't be the right thing to do as a leader if you're going to call yourself a leader. But I think we have to face the reality that as elected officials, our mindsets, our terms, the limits on our terms affect our vision, right? We don't, and you mentioned this when it comes to talking about water supply, which may happen 20 years, 30 years down the road, but if I'm an elected official today, do I gain any political capital by trying to plan for something which is going to extend beyond the time that I'm in office? So that's another reality. And that's also why the private sector, whether it's academia, whether it's the philanthropic sector, have to be at the table because they don't have those same limitations on their vision because they're not in for only a limited amount of time. So you need to have stakeholders who have long-term views on what we need to do with some of these problems and not just rely upon elected officials because by definition, their approach is going to be limited to how much more time do they have in office. And that's not really, these problems are not going to be resolved in 4 years, 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Right. They certainly don't stop at spatial boundaries or time. But Commissioner Shea, you were...
Yeah, it really is important how we talk about it. And as a former journalist, I'm really mindful of that. Plus, I got such a bad reception talking about climate change in the early days in Texas that I had to find other ways to talk about it where people could see that they had a self-interest in, trying to find solutions. And I think that's really important at this moment in time as well. And you're absolutely right, Mary. I think we do have to engage more of the philanthropic sector, but also the financial and the business sector, because at the same time that there are huge disastrous impacts. I mean, we had flooding in a more rural part of our county. People don't think of Austin as having rural areas, but Travis County does. 10 people were washed away and killed in the flooding. And hundreds of homes have been severely damaged. Many of the people can't afford the flood insurance, which is a precursor to being able to apply for the FEMA funding to rebuild. So they're going to need help. We don't have the resources at the local level, and the legislature has made numerous attempts to even shrink our ability to raise revenue to pay for any county services. So the private sector is going to have to step up, but there is also an opportunity. There is a need for more housing. There is a need for more jobs, and so there are business and economic opportunities there as well. And I don't know how much we're framing it or setting it up in those kinds of contexts, but there is a profound and growing need for these kinds of things, and there are business opportunities in that situation.
Mm-hmm. So how do you frame it as an opportunity without only serving the needs of those with the money?
Yeah.
But David, maybe from your time at Welcoming America, could you speak at all to navigating headwinds of, anti-immigrant sentiment and how you make a message like that resonate? For
sure, yeah, definitely seared into my mind all the how you deal with backlash because it's an issue. Immigration obviously is an issue that is complex and emotional, and so. Yeah, for us, for me, when I was at Welcoming America, first of all, you should plan before people come in big numbers. Like that's essential to the whole, like whether it's climate migration or international migration, whatever kind of movement of people. Don't wait till the numbers get big, because that's when it gets ugly, and you just can't get the resources when it starts to get ugly and people start to be fearful. So do it before. It's hard because it's true. Like some other problems, you got to wait till the crisis comes in order to get the resources, but somehow you got to try to avoid that, because there'll be less resources if you wait. And then to your point, Mayor, around planning, because you need a plan, but you also need to plan well. And so I agree. Like the government should be part of it, but at Welcoming America, for example, I worked on the planning process with Atlanta. We had the mayor of Atlanta. We had Coca-Cola at the table. We had immigrant leaders. It's a very multi-sector planning process in all of the welcoming cities, because you need that to be effective in implementation. You also need that because when Mayor Kasim Reed left in Atlanta, that welcoming coalition made sure the candidates for mayor for the next term were also supportive of welcoming. They'd Welcoming Atlanta program, which still exists today. This is a long time ago. And also, because you need to build buy-in. People don't want to feel like they're this is being imposed on them. So the Welcome Dayton was the first certified welcoming city, and they did the first comprehensive welcoming planning process for immigrants. They spent a year and a half doing the planning for Welcome Dayton, engaging the African American community, engaging the business community, all the different sectors. So when the plan came out and they announced that they wanted to do this, there was not a backlash, because people felt like they were part of the process, knew about the process. And that's really important, because people don't like to feel like something's being imposed on them. But there are ways to address it where they don't have to be. So I think these definitely will cross over into climate migration, or climate mobility, whatever we call it. I would say, also with climate mobility, we're talking about internally displaced people primarily. And so can a red state governor really be, can one, if people from Key West are coming to West Palm Beach because they can't live in Key West anymore, preparing for that, is that really should that be controversial? I don't know. I don't think so. And so messaging, and we're working on messaging, and it's different. It should be localized, different messages for different places. We definitely experience that at Welcoming too. So not one size fits all messaging, but do the messaging and really communicate also, communicate the benefits that, in this case, climate newcomers, newcomers coming because of climate contributions they're bringing to the local community. Also bridge building, bring people, climate migrants and native residents together, because we don't want what happened in some places after Hurricane Katrina, where you had actually backlash to Katrina refugees. So it's not always, doesn't have to be from another country for there to be a backlash. But backlash comes usually when there's not, you don't take these steps. It doesn't have to happen.
Well, that seems like a somewhat hopeful place to end. In a minute, I want to turn over to questions from the audience, but I just wanted to give you a chance. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd really like to share? Maybe Commissioner Shea.
Well, actually, David made me think of Duluth, Minnesota is promoting itself as 98% climate proof, because they've got the Great Lakes there and they've got a great big water supply. I don't know what else they're doing to prepare. You may have some more insight into that, but there are opportunities for other areas. But I just think it's so important for us to begin talking about this. Yes, it's a frightening conversation, and yes, it's a difficult problem, but I think about the grapes of wrath. Okies weren't welcome, and that was people in our country who were displaced by the Dust Bowl.
Well, you're going way back.
What?
You're going way back.
I'm just saying, we've had in our not too distant history had experiences where large populations were displaced from climate impacts. I don't think we thought about the Dust Bowl in that way, but that's what it was. But these are our country people. And at a global level, this is the human race. So I think we have to start talking about it because it will impact so many communities, either because large populations will be displaced, or because many communities will become receiving communities, and they have to prepare. There are economic opportunities, obviously, and then also costs and needs. But David's right. I mean, if you're not preparing for it, if you're not talking about it, which is why this conversation I think is really important, you will be at the mercy of it, and it can become ugly. It can become extremely difficult for your existing residents if you aren't preparing and if you aren't letting people know what's coming. So to me, that's the biggest need, and we'll never get there with climate denial and people pretending it's not happening.
Mm-hmm. So Mayor James, any final thoughts?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to continue to shine the light on this issue. But I'm going to kick the ball back into the court of our audience, particularly those who are citizens of the United States. You have to demand your political leaders to be educated on these issues. The people that you elect at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, you need to demand of them that they be broader in their thinking. Yes, there are issues that are peculiar to your city, to your state, public safety, economic development, etc. But issues like this affect us as a nation. And so you need to make sure that your political leaders are thinking in a broader way. Listen, we are a very politically divided country now, all right? And a lot of times it's over what I will call nonsensical issues, transgender rights, et cetera. Let us, you who are electing, the voters, need to, become educated on these broader issues that affect our nation as a whole. And then you need to hold the elected officials accountable and demand that they focus on some of these issues. Because if you let them define the territory, they're only going to do it on terms which are comfortable to them. All right? What are the red meat issues that will get their primary voters out so they can get reelected, which is a very selfish way of governing. So I urge you, I implore you, as those who are consumers of this country and the political leadership, you elect these people, be more demanding from an intellectual standpoint, from an intellectual honesty standpoint. Be more demanding of the political leaders, because yes, it requires more than just the politicians to be at the table. But on the other hand, the politicians do have to be at the table. And those politicians, those elected officials that you have at the table should be sensitive to these very real, very big, very major issues. And you have to hold us accountable.
Well said.
Yeah, that's a strong case. And I think with that, we should turn it to the audience.
So I just had a question. Thanks so much for coming. A quick question. So you've talked about like communications matter, how you describe the problem matters, especially when it comes to adaptation, preparing for impacts. From my perspective here, it's a lot easier to discuss impacts as opposed to cause of climate change. What is your experience in trying to describe cause? And when I say cause, I mean greenhouse gases, right? The dirty words. But how have you described that? Have you tried? Do you think we'll ever get to a place in the U.S. where we can all come to an understanding that it's greenhouse gases and we should do something about it?
I can take a start at it. I've been talking about this for a long time, and I've had to sort of change how I describe it and discuss it. But most recently, I saw some progress with regard to people's understanding of essentially cause and effect. I've been active at the national level with the National Association of Counties. And we had an annual conference in Philadelphia in July, and I brought a resolution that would put NACO, that's the acronym, on the record opposing any efforts to grant immunity to the oil and gas industry for damages from climate change. And there was a really interesting conversation at that level. You have a lot of rural counties, a lot of people who would not view themselves necessarily as on board on the whole climate change conversation, but many of them have been affected by other pollution problems. So PFAS, which is known as forever chemicals, it's wreaking havoc in rural areas. And there were a number of resolutions in the same committee before mine came up, holding the manufacturers of the forever chemicals accountable for having to bear the cost of the cleanup. So that was a great context for the conversation around holding the polluters accountable and making sure that we preserved our right to use the courts to recover damages. So that was a kind of it wasn't a cause necessarily in terms of a conversation around greenhouse gas emissions, but it was more a cause conversation related to holding the people who caused the problem accountable for the damages that were occurring when they knew that those damages would occur. So I think that's an important part of the conversation, and especially in the context of preserving our right to use the courts, because there's a huge campaign by the oil and gas lobby to get immunity from lawsuits or to prevent local governments from being able to bring these kinds of lawsuits, preemption of the rights of local governments to use the courts. So that's sort of a bit of a cause conversation with an audience that may not necessarily be on board on greenhouse gas emissions, but they didn't cause this problem, but they're having to pick up the tab and pay for all of it. And that in terms of a message and a way of talking about it is something that people can hear and understand.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for the work you do. My name's Julie Wormser. I'm the climate chief for the city of Cambridge. And one of the things that I was thinking about as Mayor James, you were talking about equity, and Commissioner Shea, you were talking about market forces, is what happens when you have a large, sudden disruption like COVID or like the collapse of homeowners insurance, which is coming for flood prone areas. In COVID, we saw the wealthiest people leave, not the poorest. And a lot of what you've been talking about is what happens when you have poor immigrants coming into a new welcoming community. I think it's going to be the wealthy folks who are going to leave. Absolutely. And our communities end up the poorer. And then you have secondary displacement from people who can no longer live in those welcoming communities. So have you thought about contingency planning from actually that loss of resources?
I think at the end of the day, you have to look at your community and see where you're more vulnerable. Those wealthy people leaving other states, they ended up in Florida, Texas, West Palm Beach, right? So our perspective is different. It doesn't mean our approach to the problem from a more global or broader scale should be different. And that's why the data is so important. And continue the good work of getting this data out there so that the political leaders that you all will elect in the future can have a roadmap. They can hopefully make decisions based upon data and not just upon anecdotes or what the political red meat. So I don't think there's one answer fits all for every community. Different communities are going to be affected in a different way. Many rich people left the Northeast, whether it's Connecticut, New York, et cetera. They ended up in my city, thank God. But I don't know what will happen if and when a major H word hits our city. And all these beautiful buildings that have been going up in West Palm Beach are now in a hurricane zone. I don't know what's going to happen then. But that goes back to planning ahead with sustainability, resilience, et cetera. Building codes are very important. So as these buildings are built, you want to make sure that they are built to accommodate certain strengths of hurricanes, category 5, et cetera, which are more common, so that hopefully the damages that might be caused by H word coming to our city will be minimized because we've been smarter about the building codes, et cetera. But I think it's got to be done on a case-by-case basis. But again, the conversation, climate migration, the impact of climate change, sea level rise, that should not be politically fraught if you've got the right data in front of people. That should not be a political issue. It's a policy issue, and get the different sectors, private sectors, philanthropic sectors, the political leaders around the table to plan ahead and plan strategically.
Dave and I were just having this conversation at breakfast, and I've been in these conversations for a long time, and it's very clear that if we don't plan for and we don't create more equitable mechanisms, we will continue the trend we're on, which is the wealthy all have lots of specialized insurance coverage, where in California, the insurance companies literally all canceled their fire insurance and left the state. And the state has created a state fire insurance program now. But the wealthy they have the ability to get specialized coverage. They're going to be okay. But it's everybody else that will be left with property that no longer has any value or is completely uninhabitable. And so we have to begin. And I think these gatherings are incredibly valuable in that regard. In 2017, I was part of a UN discussion with insurance and reinsurance companies looking at this same problem. I mean, insurance companies really understand this. That's their whole world. So they know what's coming. It's why they're pulling out of markets. It's why they're pricing insurance the way they are. But we have to demand of our institutions that they begin planning for this, because if there isn't an intentional effort to prepare for it, it will absolutely be an extreme separation between the haves and the have-nots.
Quickly.
Is it okay? You want to go?
I just want to get to a question online, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's okay?
Yeah.
Just to say that, yeah, it's true. Like, people might have an image in their head of what a climate migrant, quote unquote, is, but it really depends. And you have to be able to, like, the more data you have, the better you can be ready. And planning is essential. But yeah, like when you're talking about places in the Great Lakes region, it tends to be people who are like, all right, I'm out of here. This is good. I can see the writing on the wall. Which city will I choose? Whereas, lower income folks won't tend to move unless the hurricane hits them or is about to hit them, and they have to evacuate, and they can't afford to come back, or maybe they come back. And so places that are closest to vulnerable communities will get lower income climate migrants most likely, and places that are further away will get sort of what they call the elective climate migrants, or elective, proactively displaced people. But they all create challenges and opportunities. And yeah, like getting wealthy people in Cincinnati, that's not, that could affect your housing prices, that could affect all sorts of things. So you need to prepare, and to prepare well, you need to, the more data, the better.
I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately we're almost at time, and I wanted to get to one question online about community-based efforts. So this person is asking, can common citizens be engaged and active in the work of their city and county governments, and through which avenues?
I think you've got the best one.
We're certainly getting the right political leaders there.
Yeah, that's the starting point.
But also, this is an issue about which everyone should educate themselves. And that's why I say it's so important to continue to shine the spotlight on it. I don't know if it does well on social media, but somehow we got to figure out how to get the memes out there, how to get this message out there in a way that the younger generation can really understand the import. And we have to take the political gloss out of it, and really emphasize this is about the future of our nation. This is not a political issue. And I know that so many issues are just fraught with political ramifications, but we have to continue to separate the wheat from the chaff. There are just some basic issues that we as a country have to figure out how to deal with. And we can't continue to stick our head under the sand, and that's climate change is one of them. It's real. The data says that, and we have to continue to put the data out there and continue to shine the spotlight on this issue so that the general public, community members, community leaders can be involved at the grassroots level. And hold political leaders at the local level, state level, federal level accountable.
And yeah, just to add to that, there's lots of opportunities for community-based organizations and people that are not based with any organization but live in a community, as we all do. And yeah, I come from the community organizing, community-based world originally. Found my way into the city work, but that's why my work is about engaging both municipalities and the rest of this ecosystem, including locally based folks. A lot of the best work that's happening in the United States is being led by community-based organizations, by local organizations, sometimes in partnership with cities and sometimes not. One example of that, if you want to get involved, a lot of cities and communities have created community resilience hubs, which are places where that are looking at people who are here, but I think starting to look at also how can community resilience hub is like a physical location in a neighborhood to help people deal with all the different challenges of climate, but they could also be welcoming centers for people who are arriving from other places. Something I'm working on, but that's definitely a community-based part of the equation. Like if you want to get involved in your community, look to see if Anthropocene Alliance, which is a community-based organization working with communities across the country, if they have something going on there. If not, maybe you could help start it. Climate Migration Network is another great example of a community-based coalition working to help communities both prepare and also deal with managed retreat and all of the different challenges. So yeah, I liked your point before, Mayor, about we can't put this all on in the hands of elected officials or of cities. This is definitely an all hands on deck type of a situation. And I just want to say, when it comes to urgency, the more I've got involved in this, the more urgency I feel, and I hope that others will feel this urgency. Like in the United States, we have not done well with big migrations in the past. If you look at the Dust Bowl, if you look at the Great Migration, I mean, we're here in Boston, for God's sakes. Like that was not a great response to blacks coming from the south to the north. Even recently in all across Boston and other places. And so we're on the precipice of another great internal displacement in the United States, which could dwarf the previous ones. And so when I say all hands on deck, we need to build now. We need to plan for this now. We need to help our communities be ready for this. Again, before, you don't build a subway after everybody's got their houses up. That's not the right way to do it. Do it now. And if we had done that in these past migrations, just think about how our country could be better, could be different, could be more equitable. So this is another opportunity. So I hope we don't squander it, but we all can play a part. And I'm excited that I can play a part.
And I would just say, if you have a community resilience officer, that's a good place to reach out to begin this conversation. And if they're not already looking at these kinds of issues, they should be. But that would just be one locus at a local level that people could connect up to.
Definitely.
Well, thank you all so much.